Welcome to the Deep Dive, the Theopoetics Edition. We are Dr. Aaron Waldron, founder and CEO of Corvus Cantus, a theopoetic publishing house and creation of Lost Raven Studios. What you're hearing right now is an expansion. The original Deep Dive podcast has been a space shaped and supported by AI, a place where ideas are explored, questions are sharpened, and insight is generated through emerging technology. But this edition marks a widening of that circle. Through our partnership between Corvus Cantus and the Deep Dive podcast, the Theopoetics Edition becomes a threshold space, where artificial intelligence meets sacred imagination, where technology intersects with myth, poetry, theology, and embodied reflection. Here we focus intentionally on theopoetics. We teach, we inform, we remember, we draw from Theopoetics and the publishings of Corvus Cantus, the books, the dialogues, the voices inhabiting the liminal spaces between doubt and devotion, critique and creativity. This is not systematic theology. This is not rigid dogma. This is theology felt, spoken, questioned, reimagined. In a meta-modern age, where we oscillate between irony and sincerity, fragmentation and hope, Theopoetics offers a way forward, not by resolving tension, but by inhabiting it. So whether you are a writer, a seeker, a scholar, or simply someone holding an old smelly box of inherited beliefs, this space is for you. Welcome to the Deep Dive, Theopoetics Edition. Let's begin.
Usually when we crack open a theology book for a deep dive, you're probably bracing yourself for ancient history.
Right, just dusty scrolls and dead languages.
Exactly. You expect guys in robes arguing about the metaphysical nature of the Trinity. And it's usually pretty dry stuff, but today we are diving into something that feels a lot less like a seminary lecture and a lot more like a street fight.
It really does. It is raw, it's highly political, and honestly, it is incredibly messy.
Yeah, we are unpacking a collection of essays titled Liberation Theology and Sexuality. It was edited by the late Marcella Althaus-Reid back in 2006. And right off the bat, we have to address this massive paradox at the center of the book. Because we all know the general brand of liberation theology, right? It's famous for being the voice of the voiceless.
That is the legacy, yeah. The preferential option for the poor. It's the movement in Latin America that stood up to brutal military dictatorships in the 70s and 80s.
Saying unequivocally that God is on the side of the oppressed.
Right. It completely changed the face of Christianity in the 20th century.
Oh, it did. But here is the hook for you today. What happens when the voice of the voiceless tells a specific group of voiceless people to shut up? What happens when the theology of revolution actually becomes the oppressor?
And that is the very uncomfortable question we're grappling with. We're looking at a clash between the old guard of the 1970s, these titans who built liberation theology using Marxist analysis, and a new generation that often goes by the name indecent theologians.
And we should probably clarify for you that indecent isn't an insult here.
No, not at all. They adopted that term as a badge of honor.
So our mission today is to figure out why these two groups are basically at each other's throats. And it turns out that queering theology isn't just about being inclusive or, putting a rainbow flag in the church lobby. It's about completely dismantling how we understand power and economics.
And even God. But real quick, before we get too deep into this, we need to make it clear that the sources we're looking at contain some heavily politically charged material.
Oh, definitely. Both left-wing and right-wing ideas.
Right. And we are entirely impartial here. We are not taking sides or endorsing these viewpoints. We're simply reporting and unpacking the arguments as they exist in the original text.
Absolutely. So to understand the stakes of these arguments, we really can't start in a library. We have to start on the street. Specifically, we're going to Santiago, Chile in 1992.
Yes, the Ramilete Locas incident.
I have to say, reading this account in the source material, it just stopped me in my tracks. It totally shatters that romantic idea of a unified left fighting against the bad guys.
It really does. So let's set the scene properly for you. It's 1992. The Pinochet dictatorship is effectively over. But the wounds are incredibly fresh. The country is traumatized. And there's a massive protest march taking place against human rights violations. Front and center, you have the mothers of the disappeared.
And for those who might not know, these are the women whose children were abducted, tortured, and murdered by the regime. They are basically the ultimate symbols of moral authority in Chile.
Absolute icons of dignity and suffering. But then another group decides to join the march. a group of transvestites, homosexuals, and lesbians.
And they aren't just there to watch from the sideline.
No, they show up with their own banners.
Yeah.
They're shouting for justice right alongside the mothers because they are making a very specific, very valid point.
Yeah.
Pinochet didn't just kill leftists. He killed queer people, too.
They were victims of the exact same state terror, so they were there to show solidarity.
Exactly.
And you would expect a moment of embrace here. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We're all in this together against the dictatorship.
You would think so. But the reaction was a visceral rejection. The press at the time reported that the human rights activists, the mothers, were horrified.
Yeah.
They felt that their solemn, sacred struggle was being mocked by this. And here the phrase the press used, "Ormelete locas."
Which translates to what? Like a bunch of crazy women?
Roughly, yes. But in the slang of the time, locus was a slur for effeminate gay men, so it was more like a bunch of faggots or crazy queens. The media really played it up, contrasting the dignified pain of the mothers with the grotesque presence of the queers.
That is just a bitter irony. Althaus-Reid really highlights this. Both groups were considered deviant by the dictatorship. The regime wanted both of them gone. But the revolutionary left had zero solidarity with the sexual left. Why is that?
Well, this brings us to what the authors call the closet of liberation theology. The old guard liberationists, men like Gustavo Gutierrez or Leonardo Boff, were using Marxist analysis to understand poverty. For them, the only struggle that mattered was the class struggle.
So if you brought up gay rights, you were just distracting from the real revolution.
Worse than that, you weren't just a distraction, you were accused of being a capitalist.
Okay, wait, pause there. I understand viewing homosexuality as immoral in a traditional Catholic sense. That tracks historically. But how do they arrive at the conclusion that being gay is capitalist? That seems like a massive intellectual leap.
It is a fascinating, if totally twisted, piece of gymnastics. We have to look at early giants of the movement, like Enrique de Sel and J. Severino Croado. They built a theology based on the concept of the other.
They argue that capitalism is a system of the same.
The same, meaning egoism.
Right. You accumulate wealth for yourself, and you refuse to share with the other, meaning the poor.
Okay, I follow the economic critique there. Capitalism is a closed loop of greed where you only care about yourself.
Precisely. But then they applied that exact same structural logic to sex. They argued that homosexuality is also a love of the same. A man loving a man avoids the other, which they define strictly as the opposite sex.
So they viewed heterosexual marriage and procreation as opening up to the other.
Yes. Therefore, homosexuality was viewed as bourgeois decadence.
That is wild. They literally equated a gay relationship with hoarding wealth. Essentially, yes. They called it a sin of arrogance. To the old guard, the new man of the socialist revolution was a productive family man who made babies for the struggle. If you were gay, you were wasting your potential.
Right.
You were being selfish just like a capitalist.
That completely turns the modern culture war upside down. We are so used to the religious right bashing gay people. But here, it's the religious left using Marxist theory to say you can't be part of the revolution because you love the wrong way.
Exactly. And that is why the new generation, the indecent theologians, had to step in. They realized that you can't just add gay people to liberation theology like you're adding a new wing to a house.
The foundation itself is cracked.
Right. The whole way the theology views the body in economics is deeply flawed.
Which brings us to one of the best metaphors I think we have ever seen in a theology book on this show. Ivan Petrella's chapter uses the TV show Queer Eye for the straight guy.
It is brilliant. It makes a very dense theoretical point instantly understandable.
And for you listening, if you haven't seen the show or maybe haven't seen it since the early 2000s, the premise is that 5 gay experts, the Fab Five, basically swarm the house of a disheveled, clueless straight man. They fix his hair, his clothes, his cooking, and his house.
And in Petrella's argument, liberation theology is the disheveled straight guy.
That is just a great image. A grand theology sitting around in bad sweatpants eating cold pizza.
Basically. Petrella argues that by the 2000s, liberation theology was stuck in the 70s. It was grumpy, it was wearing outdated clothes, and most importantly, it had lost its job. It wasn't changing the world anymore.
Because global capitalism had won.
Exactly. So Petrella says it needs a queer eye makeover to become relevant again.
So what is the diagnosis from the experts? Why is the straight guy failing to get the job?
This is the key insight, and it is counterintuitive. The problem is that liberation theology hates capitalism too much.
Too much? I thought the entire point was to oppose capitalism.
It is. But think about how they described it. The old guard described capitalism as this total all-encompassing system of sin. They said it controls the banks, The governments, the media, and even our desires. They made it sound omnipotent.
Oh, I see where you're going. If you describe your enemy as all-powerful,
You inadvertently turn it into a god. A dark god, an evil god, but a god nonetheless. If capitalism is everywhere and inescapable, then resistance is futile. You are paralyzed. You have given the enemy divine attributes.
so the queer makeover is about shrinking the enemy down to size.
Exactly. This is where queer theory comes in. Queer theory looks at gender and says this isn't a fixed eternal law written in the stars. It is a performance. It is a script we repeat every day. Petrella argues we should view capitalism the exact same way.
Like a drag show.
Yes. Capitalism isn't a monolith of granite. It is a drag show. It relies on millions of people waking up and repeating certain behaviors. It is performative. And if it is a performance, it can be disrupted. It is fragile.
I love that. It strips the divinity away from the economy. You aren't fighting a god. You are just disrupting a script. That feels so much more actionable for people.
It empowers you to act. If the economy is just a bad performance, we can get on stage and change the play. Now, speaking of imperfections and disruptions, we have to talk about Claudio Carvalhais and his concept of limping theology.
This was my favorite visual in the whole deep dive. We are moving from the makeover to the injury.
Carvalhais takes us back to the biblical story of Jacob wrestling the angel at Peniel. It's a classic story. Jacob fights all night, he survives, but the angel touches his hip socket. He leaves that encounter with a new name, Israel, but he walks with a limp for the rest of his life.
He is never straight again.
Pun very much intended. Carvalhais argues that honest theology shouldn't walk straight. It shouldn't try to be perfect or systematic or European. It should be improper. It should limp. And to explain this, he points to a Brazilian cultural icon, Garrincha.
The soccer player.
The angel with bent legs. Garrincha was a marvel. He had a deformed spine, and his knees actually bent in opposite directions.
Yeah.
By all medical standards, by all decent standards, he shouldn't have been able to walk properly, let alone play professional sports.
But on the field, that deformity made him unpredictable. He could dribble in ways a straight player just couldn't.
He turned his defect into his genius. And Carvalhais contrasts this with how theology usually works. Usually theology tries to be proper. It tries to have all the answers, to be logical, to be clean. But Latin America is messy. It is a mix of races, religions, and sexualities. It is a mestiçagem.
So a limping theology embraces that mess rather than trying to fix it or hide it.
Exactly.
And that connects directly to the self-criticism from Otto Maduro in the book, doesn't it? Because he's one of the older generation, but he openly admits they messed up.
He does. He calls for epistemological humility, which is basically a fancy academic way of saying we need to admit we don't know everything.
Yeah.
He points out that the people who wrote the original liberation theology were almost exclusively white, educated, celibate priests.
Talk about a very specific demographic. They were speaking for the poor, but they had zero actual experience with the lives of women or indigenous people or queer people.
Right. They missed what the book calls the others. They missed the people who were limping the most because they were too busy trying to walk straight and be respectable revolutionaries.
Okay, so if we are going to stop walking straight, we also need to stop reading the Bible straight. We need to talk about the saints, specifically the women, Eve and Mary Magdalene.
This is where the indecent theologians really go on the offensive. They argue that our traditional view of these women is based entirely on economic and sexual control.
Let's start with Eve. Nancy Cardoso Pereira has a take on the Garden of Eden that sounds more like a shopping trip than a fall from grace.
It really does. Traditionally, Eve is the sinner. She breaks the rule. She's the reason we can't have nice things. But Pereira looks at the text. Eve sees the fruit, sees that it is pleasing to the eye and desires it. Pereira argues this is the birth of the consumer.
But she frames that as a good thing.
She frames it as agency. Eve isn't just a rule breaker. She is a woman discovering she has desires and acting on them. Pereira says, we need to stop worshiping misethics and misreligion, these boring, obedient figures, and understand Eve as someone engaging with the world erotically and economically. She initiated a market relation.
That is a heavy pivot from how it's normally taught. But the Mary Magdalene section is even more provocative. I feel like Mary Magdalene is the ultimate theological battleground in this book.
She truly is. Martin Hugo Cordovaquero breaks it down into 3 versions of Mary that history has given us. First, you have the traditional one, the weeping prostitute.
Right.
She is sorry for having sex. She gives it up. She washes Jesus' feet with her tears and hair. That is the bad girl gone good narrative.
That is the one Sunday school teaches you. It reinforces that female sexuality is something to be ashamed of. So what are the other 2?
Then you have the Gnostic or heterodox version. This comes from ancient texts outside the Bible, like the Gospel of Thomas. In these texts, Mary is a leader, a real heavy hitter. But there is a massive catch. To be holy, she has to become male.
Male, metaphorically.
Spiritually. There is a line where Jesus literally says, I will make her male, that she too may become a living spirit. The idea in that era was that female equals flesh and bad, and male equals spirit and good. So she could be a leader, but only if she effectively stops being a woman.
Okay, that is not exactly feminist liberation. That is just erasure.
Exactly. Which leads to the third version, the feminist version. In recent decades, feminist scholars have tried to save Mary. They argue, hey, there is no proof she was a prostitute at all. That was just a smear campaign by the patriarchy. They try to portray her as a wealthy, independent patron. A decent woman.
That sounds like progress, though, right? Cleaning up her reputation.
But the indecent theologians shout, stop right there. They argue that by trying so hard to prove Mary wasn't a prostitute, you are agreeing with the patriarchy that being a prostitute is shameful.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought of it that way. You were just playing by their rules.
They ask the truly dangerous question. What if she was a prostitute and she was still a holy leader? Why can't she be a sexual being and an apostle at the exact same time?
It is challenging the whole idea that a woman has to be decent to be worth listening to.
Real liberation isn't about proving you are good by the oppressor's standards. It is about rejecting those standards entirely.
And this connects directly to the story in the book about the AMAR union in Argentina, the National Union of Sex Workers.
Yes. This brings it all down to earth beautifully. You have a sex worker who's part of this union. She encounters a church group, and she is genuinely shocked when she realizes the church group is interested in her health, her safety, and getting her condoms.
Why was she so shocked by that?
Because in her experience, religious people only ever cared about her soul. They wanted her to repent. They wanted her to quit. They didn't care about her labor rights or her physical safety on the street or her health.
That is the ultimate disconnect. The church wants to save her from her reality, but she needs liberation within her reality.
Exactly. The indecent approach says God isn't just in the repentance. God is in the condoms. God is in the labor rights. It is about stripping away the underwear of theology, all these layers of decency and metaphor, to see the naked reality of people's economic and physical lives.
So let's pull this all together for you. We started with a protest where the revolutionary left rejected queer activists because they supposedly represented capitalist egoism. We moved to a queer theology that treats capitalism not as a god, but like a fragile drag show. And we ended with a Mary Magdalene who doesn't need to be cleaned up to be holy.
The through line here is decency. The old guard failed because they were too obsessed with being decent, with having traditional families and proper revolutionary morals.
They tried to build a totally new society using the exact same old rules of who gets to speak and who gets to love.
Right. The indecent theologians are saying, you cannot have economic liberation without sexual liberation. You're deeply linked. If you control people's bodies, you are doing the work of the oppressor, even if you call yourself a socialist or a revolutionary.
It really forces you to look at your own biases.
Right.
How much of our politics today, whether left or right, is really just about enforcing decency or what we think proper looks like?
It is usually far more than we would like to admit. Decency is very often just a mask for control.
So here is a final provocative thought for you to chew on after listening today. The book shows how traditional theology failed because it made its enemies, like capitalism, into these giant, scary gods. And queer theology countered that by saying everything is just a performance, a script we keep repeating.
Yes.
But if that's true, how does that apply to the movements we are building right now? If we stop trying to be decent and we recognize that our own modern social orthodoxies are just scripts too, are we accidentally creating our own new old guards? By demanding ideological purity today, whose limping, improper voices are we silencing right now without even realizing it?
That is the risk. It is unstable. It limps. But maybe, just maybe, that is how we finally walk forward.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
A pleasure.
Catch you next time.